Yep, it's going.
Yes.
Okay.
We're live.
Hi, everybody. Yes, welcome to the end of the first day of QuaranCon. You are, just to orientate yourself, make sure you're in the right place. You are at Panzers versus Plotters. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. I didn't know if you were talking to us or talking to the people out there. I presume there is some people. Hello, people.
Hello, wonderful people.
I'm sorry, I had a little bit of a feedback loop there from YouTube messing me up. So anyway, I'll do the intro again. It's like, we are here to talk about Panzers versus Plotters. And the words that I am supposed to say are you organized, methodical, and precise? Or are you more like a cat chasing a laser? And by the looks of some of this crew, I think they may fall into this latter. And so, or are you somewhere in between? How is the story brought together and what works for you? So really excited to be here. My name is officially on the book, King's Hold, my first book. It's DP Waterscroft, but I'm Dave. I'm going to be your moderator today. It's really about kind of like the other stars that we've got here today. I'd like to give everybody a minute or so to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to crack on with the interrogation to see if we can work out who wins in Panzers versus Plotters. So Anna, why don't you go first? You're first on my screen.
Oh my goodness. Right. Okay. I'm hoping everyone can hear me and see me. My name is Anna Smith Spark. I have the slight misfortune possibly to tweet as the Queen of Grimdark. I'm the author of these books, The Court of Broken Knives, The Tower of Living and Dying, and How to Sacrifice, out in paperback from all closed bookshops a couple of weeks ago. Good timing. The Empires of Dust trilogy, described as a masterwork of dark fantasy. And the Daily Mail's favourite fantasy novelist, apparently, which is slightly disturbing. But yes, I write
Right.
violent, poetic, lyrical, knob joke, extremely violent grimdark fantasy.
Wonderful. Can't beat some knob jokes. RJ, well, you're next.
Oh, hello. Welcome to my home. I'm RJ Barker. I'm the author of the Wounded Kingdom books, which are Age of Assassins, King of Assassins, and Blood of Assassins, but not in that order, actually. I always get that wrong. But they're kind of like fantasy murder mysteries with quite sort of involved plots, and then there's a kind of murder mystery that goes over all three books. So you'd think I was very organized, wouldn't you? No. And this is my newest book, The Bone Ships, which is a fantasy naval mystery with dragons. I described it as Hornblower versus Godzilla to my publisher when I tried to sell it to them, and my agent said never say that because it sounds silly, and I presume he wanted me to tell everybody, otherwise he wouldn't tell me not to do it because I'm a contrary beast. And Robin Hobb called it brilliant, so obviously I never need to write again. Now that's me done. There'll never be any more RJ Barker books. I've reached the pinnacle. I'm finished.
Wonderful, thanks RJ. Simon.
Hi guys, so I'm Simon. I'm unlike everyone else. I haven't bought books to show you. I feel like I should have brought some books to hold up.
You're sitting in your own house. Go and get them.
Run off, get them.
They're somewhere around here, but I'm a British fantasy science fiction author. I've written about 10 books so far. There's a fantasy trilogy called the Cloven Land trilogy. I'm just finishing a hard science fiction trilogy, actually, which has been quite heavily plotted, so that might have a bearing on the conversation. I also write lots of short stories, and I'm also writing some urban fantasy kind of detective kind of murder stories as well at the same time.
Wonderful, thanks Simon. And last but not least, Megan.
Hi, Megan Haskell. I write the Senyari Chronicles, which is a fast-paced fantasy adventure with a kick-ass heroine, her carnivorous pixie sidekicks, and a quest across 9 fairy realms. I also just released the first in a new trilogy called Forged in Shadow. And my name drop is Jay Andrews said it was a gripping tale of the reckless destruction wrought by the powerful and the bone deep bravery of those who seek to stop them. That's my favorite quote. But it just released about 2 weeks ago, so I'm really excited about that one. And then I'm also a co-founder of the Author Wheel, which is a website and teaching company we just launched. I launched with a partner, and we strive to help writers become authors and keep their stories rolling. So that's me.
Excellent. Thanks, Megan. Okay, so we'll get kicked off with some questions. First of all, what we're here for is kind of plotters versus pantsers. I think we want to talk about, find out what's your writing style, what's your method, which side are you going to pick? And I'm going to declare first. So I am definitely a plotter. I'm also kind of like quite organized outside of writing life in some ways. I like spreadsheets and stuff. So that means that as I come to do my writing, I end up kind of plotting pretty heavily from the top down through to then chapter outlining. And then even before I sit down on the computer, I have to outline every scene that I'm going to write, just so that I know what I'm doing. And part of that is just because I squeeze my writing in around my day job, and it makes me much more productive as I'm doing that. And it also means that I mean, personally, I love the plotting part because I get to race through the story and think about what's happening from characters and think about all the different questions that I've got. And so I typically use a notebook and kind of like scratch stuff down in there. So me, I'm definitely a plotter. But Megan, what you pick a side. And nobody can allowed to sit on the fence. Everyone's got to pick a side.
Sitting on the fence. I am.
It's not allowed.
Sitting on the fence. No, I'm a planter. Came up with my own term. A planter. No, I actually really started off as a pantser, as a discovery writer, whatever, which is ironic because I also really like spreadsheets. I used to be an analyst in a previous life. I am good with numbers and spreadsheets and all of that. So you would think I would be very organized and very much a plotter. But when it comes to the creative side of things, I like to follow my characters. But I also found that because of that, I get lost in the weeds a lot. So I started using a spreadsheet with a rough, like basically the beats from Save the Cat, if you know Save the Cat. Or you can use it, actually, I've just started doing it with the 3-story method by Jay Thorne. So different ways of structuring your story. Put it on a spreadsheet, and then I fill it in as I go. So if I know I have certain events and things, then I put them on there early. But if I try to do a line by line or scene by scene outline like that, I get bored so fast and I won't actually write the story. I've tried doing it that way too, and I just won't write it. It just won't happen.
Right, you've basically worked out what's going to happen by then anyway. That is the danger. Yeah.
Yeah, but then I want to go back and make it pretty, So.
Yeah. Simon, what about you? Pick a side.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to pick a side either. I'm afraid I'm sitting on that fence. Temperamentally, I really should.
I don't know that one.
Sorry, Alexa just spoke.
Hi, Alexa.
I really should be.
Hi, Alexa.
Order toilet roll.
Yes, do. I temperamentally, I really should be a plotter. I mean, I'm the sort of person who has spreadsheets and for everything going on in my life. But I never ever do that with novels. I always, discover it as I go along. What I tend to do is I know where I'm going to start pretty obviously, and I know where the book is going to end up, and who's going to be alive and who's not going to be alive, and where they are, and that. And then I just start writing and get from A to B, basically. But I would love to be able to plot it all out ahead of time and then just write that. But I would worry that I would get bored as well. I would just think, well, this is just mechanical now. I don't need to do that. It's the process of writing that I find exciting. So, and when the characters surprise you and then do the wrong thing and go off at a funny angle, that's the joy of it for me.
Characters will do that, definitely. Okay, RJ, I think I have a pretty good idea where you are.
Yeah, I've never planned anything in my entire life. I'm an odd little chaos pixie who just sort of goes out into the world and see what happens, and that is how I write as well. Though it's a bit of like my first book, Age of Assassins, that came into my head as an entire book, just kind of landed in my mind, and I did kind of write a table with roughly what would happen in some places, which I then never looked at again. And then from then on, I've just sort of decided I'll sit down and write a book, and I sit down and write a book. I know the end, because I figure if you know the end, then everything else will fall into place. And I just go at it with as much joy as possible and have as much fun. And I never delete anything. So if I do something incredibly stupid, I look upon, I hate being told what to do, even by myself. So if I do sort of write down this has to happen, that's more or less me saying, right, find a way for this not to happen now. But even if I write something and it's incredibly stupid, rather than thinking, right, I'll just delete that and make my life easier, I feel compelled to make it work somehow. So that's kind of, I'm constantly fighting myself, and that's sort of where the joy is in solving problems as you roll along and finding out where the story goes. Because I don't really, I always think about octopuses. I don't know if you know this about octopuses. They have a distributed intelligence, and when we say put your arm out and pick something up, you know that your arm is going to lift and pick something up, and you know how it'll do it. With an octopus, it just says, I want that thing, and its arm does it for it, but it doesn't know how it's going to happen. And that's kind of how I think I write, like an octopus, but with less arms.
Which is a shame, because it would probably be faster if you had more.
I don't know, my typing's very bad just with two. I think it'd be worse.
Right. Okay, so far we got two people on the fence, one clearly defined pantser. That's good. And so, Anna, you're actually the casting vote now, since we had two people that couldn't make it.
So I came up with the incredibly pretentious term that I am a Platonist. The book exists in Platonic form in some kind of entirely higher, better universe. And I'm just kind of finding it. So when I've spoken about this before, when I started writing The Court of Broken Knives, which was the first book I ever wrote, it was the first piece of fiction I wrote since I was a child. Didn't even know I was writing a novel, let alone I was writing a grimdark fantasy novel, the first part of a trilogy. I had a scene, I started writing it, I had no idea what was happening, I had no idea the characters were. So the reveals in the book, when people start talking about who they are, or when things happen, or when people talk about why they've done something, or that they were the person that did something, I had no idea. I had no idea what was going to happen until the point where I wrote that. And then suddenly what had been going on before made sense. But then when I was about 2/3 of the way through the book, suddenly the whole trilogy completely just revealed itself to me. And at that point, I knew absolutely what the whole book was, what everything was about, what the point of what I was writing was, what I was trying to say when I was writing it, kind of what part of me it was channeling. And I just wrote the trilogy. And that has now just happened again. I've just finished a new book. I have no idea what's going to happen to it. But again, that was kind of very much kind of groping around. I wasn't sure I was writing. I had a scene in my head. I had no idea I was going to go for it. And then the whole book was there. And I really kind of, when I'm writing, it's intensely frustrating process for me. I know it's there. I know it's up there. It exists. And I'm trying to write it down. And it really is like I'm trying to take dictation. It's like I'm desperately trying to write this thing down. I can see it in my mind. I just have to get it down. And it's so frustrating because I'll get it wrong. And it won't be as good as I can see it. And there'll be passages and I'll just be like, I can't get this right. I can't get this. And yeah, it really is like someone's telling me the book, like the whole book already exists. And I'm desperately trying to, it's like I read the book and I'm desperately trying to rewrite it from memory. So it's absolutely exhausting.
Is that person on another plane just dripping you the little pieces that you need at that moment in time? Or is it all just there waiting to gush out?
The whole thing is there. The whole thing is there.
Yeah.
It's
Nice.
just, I know it's there and I just have to get it. I just have to reach it and get it. It's like having read a book and you know everything about that book, and then you're desperately trying to. It's like if I set you a task to retype out your book. That's
Right. Yeah.
so it's absolutely shattering, basically.
Do you
Yeah.
feel like you're?
Yeah.
Do you feel like you're channeling it? I often feel like I'm channeling something
Yeah, so
from somewhere else.
it's interesting. My PhD thesis was on various occult groups, and I can really see why people like Yeats and a lot of early modernist writers were really interested in the idea of automatic writing and the idea of kind of mediumship, because I can kind of see that link between that sense of there's this kind of weird moment where you're kind of like, oh my God, that's why that thing that I knew was really important at the beginning of the book. And I didn't really know why it was important at the time, but I understand it now. That's why. Or I don't know where this is going. Yeah, it is. I can see why writers are interested in that kind of thing, because it does kind of like that. It's whatever. It's my subconscious. It's just there already, and I'm just writing.
I always think that my subconscious is a much better and kinder writer than I am, because I'll think, oh my God, I wish there were talking green dogs. It would be so good if there were talking green dogs. That would make this work. And then when you go back and read, actually there are talking yellow dogs, but you just need to change that a little bit. And I often find that I've done that. I've set all this stuff up for myself that I'm just totally unaware of until I go through my second read. Yeah.
That's very interesting, because I was going to ask, like, how do people kind of who are not plotting, who are kind of discovering as they go along or channeling, like, how do you handle foreshadowing? Kind of, like, is it something where you're aware of it at the time, or you go back and work out how to make sure that something is actually foreshadowed? Because by the time you get there, you're like, oh, that was a bit of a surprise.
Generally, for me, I'm reading it back and I think, oh look, I did some foreshadowing there. That was clever.
Yeah, there. It's kind of, it is somehow there because obviously part of your mind, part of my mind obviously thought it was important. I mean, obviously there are things where I'll go back and change. I remember, the weird thing, because The Course of Broken Knives was the first thing I had written, it was the first piece of fiction I'd written since I was about 20. And this amazing day when I realized I could go back and change something on the computer screen that I'd written 2 weeks ago. It wasn't like, it was just there on a computer file. I could just go back and change it. And that was this amazing moment of revelation when I discovered this and how much easier it was, rather than feeling like I was stuck with some minor character's hair being yellow on chapter 2. And now that is stuck like that for the entirety of the universe, even though for some obscure reason I want to change the hair color in chapter 20. And this discover I could do that. But yeah, no, a lot of it is just kind of there anyway. Although I read this lovely thing Hilary Mantel talking about how sometimes when she's writing, she'll write a huge amount, and sometimes she'll go back and take a single image. And so this little description of threading it like a ribbon through the text. So she'll spend weeks and her word count will hardly go up, but she's just threading this single image like a ribbon through the text. And like that, I love that as an image of how you go back and put images or foreshadow or put in little symbolic things.
And I found I did that a lot with Forged in Shadow too, because Forged in Shadow for me is, it's the first like epic, like true epic that I've written with point of view, multiple characters, so forth and so on. And so because I do follow the characters more, I knew certain events had to happen, but beyond that, I didn't plot anything. And so what I ended up doing was a lot of that, like, sort of subconscious, just because I've been thinking so much about the story, there's so much going on kind of in the background, I call it percolating, that as I was writing, there were things I certainly put in the book that I didn't know what they were really there for, or I used later on for foreshadowing, etc. But there were also characters that I didn't existed that I killed that I then had to go back and write into the story. And so it was definitely a more circular process than linear. As my previous books, it was one point of view character, so it was chronological. I could just go linear through the story. But with this one, it was more circular, even spiral. Like as I went through the editing process and as I was writing it, there was a lot of just going back and seeing how everything worked and making it work in a way that made sense for the story.
So actually, because I'll also have multiple, I'll be writing multiple sections at once, by which I don't mean I have different computer files, but I'll be in the middle of writing and I'll suddenly think there was a sentence 5 chapters ago that I need to change slightly, and I will go back and do that. And I do that constantly. So yeah, that image of the spiral, yeah, that kind of constantly going back on your own text and just absolutely just being surrounded by the text rather than it being in the process. That's a really nice image for it.
And that's how I defeat writer's block, if you want to call it that too. If I get stuck somewhere, it's always because I either haven't thought through what that character, or I haven't inhabited that character well enough yet to know where they need to go, or there's something that's just not quite right in the prior text. And so if I go back and insert that or fix that, then I can move on. Or I can write a different character and do a different section of the novel. Again, still I use Scrivener. So it's, still all within that same file, different chapter, different text file, maybe within Scrivener, but within that same project file. But that allows me to keep moving even when I'm stuck.
Yeah, that's good. Simon, anything to add? Like how you handle foreshadowing?
Well, I when I write, I do tend to have like big themes in mind. I have, particular, like we were just saying, I have sort of central themes which I know are going to come into play. And I find my subconscious automatically just weaves these into the story. But I will edit an awful lot as well. I said at the start, I'm a software developer as well. And my brain has got used to just constantly going all over the thing I'm working on and changing bits and pieces here and there. So although I do tend to write in a linear fashion, when I'm really into it, the whole structure is in my head and I can just dot around and fill in pieces in different chapters and descriptions. And I do lots of going back and revising because I've come up with some other idea later on that meant that such and such a character can't have done that.
Yeah.
And the other thing I do is, although I've said I don't plot much, what I tend to do is kind of mini plot. So I find that my best writing I do kind of in my head as I'm working, walking around, whatever it may be, and it's all just going on in my head. And then when I come to actually do the writing, I just sit down and my fingers do all the work, and I'm not really. It almost feels like I'm not there. I'm just the conduit for it. So I'm sort of plotting out each section or each chapter, but it's still a process of discovery as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's good. So one of the things that's, I think, kind of important in pretty much all fantasy is the world building side of things, or the research that goes into the little details that you get in there. So how do you handle that? Like, do you approach research before tackling a project and thinking about the world, or you kind of like doing it along the way and you're like, oh, there's this thing and I should probably know what I'm talking about before I start making it up?
Oh, research. I've never heard this word before. I tend to write about things that I already know something about, and then I don't have to do any research. And one of the joys of fantasy, supposed to, because I'm right on the edge between writing historical fiction and fantasy. I think a lot of the time, I can't write historical fiction because I get lost in research. It's too interesting. And I started writing a thing set in Spain during the Napoleonic Wars, and I needed to know where a certain general was during a certain week. And then 3 weeks later, I was still reading about Spain in the Napoleonic Wars, but I'd written nothing. So I don't do any research. I make it all up, and I just go along, and I might get some pretty pictures. I bought a lot of Patrick O'Brien painting books for the Bone Ship, so I've got a lot of pictures of ships. So if the taxman's watching, that's why I've applied for all that tax relief on books. But that's the full extent of my research. I don't do any. I just write a book. And that's what I do. But I write a book that I already have some knowledge about, so I can cheat. I don't need to go and look at stuff.
No, I didn't. So I didn't do any world building at all before I started writing. I've never world built. I've kept a sort of file making note of things as I go along. But yeah, I mean, the world and the things about it are everything I love. I'm complete history nerd. I'm a complete sort of travel writing nerd. I studied history, various periods of history for all my different degrees. And yeah, so it's a kind of, it's just everything that I love and I'm interested in just mushed together. And again, it's all kind of up there and it just comes out. But I mean, I'll check things. There's kind of, I'll just random Google searches constantly about, I don't know, things that plants that should be in flower at the right time, or kind of that sort of stuff. I just read books all the time. I just read a huge amount of history books anyway, so a lot of the stuff about military stuff. So actually the battles in the Empires of Dust are all historical battles. They're either Alexander's battles or a couple of them are Hannibal's battles. And those were written using someone's schematic of their attempt to reconstruct Gaugamela and their attempt to reconstruct Cumae. But I just had those books lying around and I knew that those were the battles I wanted to use. But yeah, I'd done research into, I will research battles. It was like, okay, I need to write Maris Gaugamela, so I'm going to get my copy of my particular, my favourite work of Alexander, and use his reconstruction of Gaugamela. It wasn't kind of researching a particular battle, it was just, damn, I love that battle.
Right, you already know that it's there. That's good. Megan, what about you?
So for me, like before I started writing Word 1 of the Senyari Chronicles, I spent 3 or 4 months doing world building. And it wasn't all necessarily research per se. I mean, some of it was, but a lot of it relied on my reading history, just fantasy tropes, things that I had from being a lifelong reader, I had already kind of embedded themselves in my brain, things that I knew about mythology. And then I had this core concept of, I wanted to take actual human myths and mythological creatures and then twist them and make them different. And I had this concept that, so I have the 9 fairy realms. And if the 9 fairy realms actually existed, if these elves and these creatures actually existed, how would they influence humanity and how would humanity influence them, and so forth and so on. So I spent 3 months laying this all out. And I did it, that was what I was doing. It was not, I didn't write like anything toward the novel at that point. It was just all world building. And so once I had that set up, for me, that made all of the world aspects, all the settings, all of the, the cultures and the histories of these people. I actually didn't have to put it in the novel because I had it in my head. So it just came out, if that makes sense. So that's how I did it. I did this massive world building project in the beginning. Since then, obviously the Senyari Chronicles are all set in that same universe, but also the new series is set in that same universe, but just 2,000 years prior, 3,000 years prior. So it builds on all that same content that I already had. So what I found myself doing more recently is having to do more detailed research into specific topics. So for Forged in Shadow, I have never actually forged a sword. Go figure, right? Like, I know there are lots of people out there that do. I'm not one of them. So I had to research that actually in a lot of detail, and I, reached out to a local blacksmith and talked to people about that. So I actually do a lot of that, what I call prep work, as much in advance as I can, but inevitably I always come across things that I still either don't understand well enough or, find all of a sudden, because I'm discovery writing, right? Like all of a sudden it's like, oh, I need to learn about, something, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example, but something else. And so I'll stop and pause and do another, few days often of research on that. But I also do find that I can get too caught up in that sometimes. So I have to give myself cutoff dates and times and limits. Otherwise it takes too much away from the writing. But for me, that all informs that subconscious discovery of the story and of these characters that I'm trying to share it to the readers.
I mean, I guess it depends a lot what you're writing. So so my stuff is very it's quite mythic. I don't necessarily have a sense of it having a complete coherence. So people fairly randomly use either bronze or iron weaponry, and they're using, so there's this kind of, I mean, it doesn't work as a technology. It's not a kind of coherent technological society. People use bronze sometimes because I wanted to talk about the killing bronze. I wanted to be Homeric. People use iron because I want to talk about things like forged iron and cold iron, because again, that's important. But it's not coherent. But if you think about someone like Miles Cameron, who's writing very, very specific, he's got that very specific sense of his mythic knights, his Arthurian knights. He's very, very technical about the armor. And obviously that's something he knows a great deal about. But if he was then to have something like ships, and he was clearly to not, it was, I don't know, something, it was something he didn't know about as well, and was then totally non-technical and had all kinds of random bits from different periods all shoved together. It just wouldn't work in his world. So because what he's doing was, I have all kinds of different boats knocking around again, because I wanted, the whole point is it's kind of this slightly weird mythical, it's got that sort of mythical dream feel to it. So it depends on what you're writing. It depends on the way your world works and what you're writing about.
In the bone ships, I invented the terminology of ships from the ground up, because I wanted it to reflect their world and their society and the way they thought, and I thought that was important, the way they referred to the ship and the parts of it. And also, ships are incredibly complicated, and I didn't want to do the work.
Right. Wise man.
So it was kind of a double thing. So I won on both sides. It's not that. I wish I'd stuck with actual ships, because it's really hard. You have to remember all this stuff. I've just finished copy editing the second one, and my copy editor did this, which is a list of every character and ship and which ship they're on, and all the bits and all the places they go. And this has never occurred to me. It's brilliant. Everyone should do this. If you've not, it's a really good idea.
You don't keep track of the stuff you make.
I had to reverse engineer a conlang. I had to construct a conlang from the original words of it that I'd really begun to, which I'd managed to do successfully.
That's great. Simon, anything to add to that?
Well, I do very, very, very little research as well, I have to say. I think I mentioned I'm just finished writing a science fiction trilogy, and unfortunately with that you do have to research the way physics works and that sort of thing. And I'm very much looking forward to not doing that anymore and getting back to some fantasy, so I can basically just make it up and no one can complain. But the key is obviously consistency, right? You make up whatever you want, but you have to not make up stuff which contradicts what you said half a book ago. So I just start writing and slowly discover the magical system or the lands or the people, whatever they may be. And I feel like my brain has just been researching stuff all its life, and it just has all these ideas, things in it, and they just pop up and sort of attach to the story.
That's what fantasy is. Fantasy is that kind of absolute creation of your dreams. It's you really are just pouring out absolutely just the things that you absolutely love or are terrified of into this kind of fantastical. You are creating your own world. You're creating this. If you could inhabit anywhere in the universe, this is where you would be. Yeah, it is it's a total immersive thing rather than it's a wonderful romantic thing where you're kind of recreating yourself. So yeah, I kind of too much of that kind of research into, but it's when people always say, but it's not realistic. Well, no.
Yeah. I mean, personally for me, it's like, and there's another panel on Tuesday around curiosity. It's like you say, it's your own world, Anna. Yeah. And so as I'm building my world, I'm really curious about finding out other things that I don't necessarily know about. So it's like, it's expanding my reading, which is not really research, but it's like being inspired by history or how stuff happened, and then making sure that I completely detach it from reality so that nobody can then tell me that it's wrong.
Yes.
So I still want to be able to, but like I've been inspired. That's all I need. Thank you very much. I will now take this.
Because there's that kind of classic thing, that thing about there are very few plots, that sort of thing about how many. I can never remember how many plots it is that people would.
Seven. It's seven, isn't it? Seven.
And if you think about fantasy, there are very, very few plots. There are very, very, very few plots in fantasy. And most of us are kind of fundamentally telling the same 4 stories or so, but it's the world and how the characters experience the world and how they move around that world and what that world is like. That's surely the interesting thing. I mean, so many, you know, the Book of the New Sun, the Second Apocalypse, Marazan, they're all actually pretty much basically the same. They're not earth-shattering different stories, but the world, it's the world, it's the world and the way that the characters move through the world, and maybe, yeah, the kind of exciting reveals about who's who or kind of the secrets people are holding. But fundamentally, that's what you're looking at. That's what you're doing. That's what we're doing here. We're not writing incredibly complicated police procedurals.
The plot of all fantasy is some people go somewhere.
Yes. Some people sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't.
Yeah, hopefully they did something when they got there.
Yeah. They go somewhere and do something.
Yes. So so quick time check. It's kind of 41 minutes past the hour. For folks on the chat, we got 15 minutes reserved for questions. So now's a good time to stick your questions in the chat. And then in the meantime, I'm going to ask the scariest question, surely, for anybody, for any author, as they are thinking about, you know, these kind of complex worlds and laying things out, make stuff as you go along. Where have you screwed up in the past? Like, what continuity errors have you had? What plot holes? How close of a call has it nearly made it to the final manuscript? Or, you know, if you really want to admit it, which ones are actually out there and nobody's noticed?
I've got two. In Blood of Assassins, for the special edition, Tom Parker, who's my friend who does a lot of art with me, did a map for it. And I just said, like, just read the book, Tom, and draw a map. And he was going, no, RJ, you have to do it. It's your world. You have to draw the map. And I didn't want to because it sounded like work. But I finally did it, and I had to plot out where my characters went during the book. And it turned out that what they actually did was this. and go backwards and forwards over about a kilometre for the entire book, when they were meant to be traversing this entire world. And I was like, oh, well, thank you, Tom, for making me do that. But so we caught that one, and I've just done the copy edit for Call of the Bone Ships. And I found out that in Call of the Bone Ships, there was one character who was on 4 different ships at the same time. Which was quite glad we caught that. And I'm trying to think of one that's out there. My copy editors have been really good at and really sort of obsessive and saved me a lot. But what's out there? There is, I think, in the Bone Ships, there's one place where I say sun rather than Skewis, which is what they call the sun, and that got through. And I think at one point in the Wounded Kingdom trilogy, which is in many ways a retelling of the Arthurian story, I use the name of an Arthurian character rather than the actual character's name in the book. And that's got through somewhere, but I think only one person has noticed it. But if now you're looking for it, I'm not telling you which book it's in, but it's in one of them.
Everybody's going to rush away and do that. Simon,
rush out and buy the books and read them.
Yes.
Right.
I can't think of any actual examples, but I do confess that this is one big advantage that ebooks have over print books, because more than once I have got to the 3rd book in a trilogy and thought, oh, I just said something that contradicts something that I said in book 1. I'll just quietly go back and change book 1 and upload it again. Hopefully no one will notice. Now, obviously you can't do that with print very easily, but I've done that several times, I do confess.
That's good. And does anybody who's been with you since the beginning of the story notice it and let you know?
No, nobody's ever noticed, no.
Wonderful. That's good.
No, so far. So they've never told me anyway.
Yeah. Megan.
Well, I've had a lot of detail things that I think were all caught before publication. Some by my mom, actually. She's kind of my final proofer. But of note, there was a character who only had one hand. His other hand had been cut off. And all of a sudden he had two hands. So I had to fix that. And then I already told the story. So it was, to be fair, it was in the midst of drafting the first draft, but I killed a character that didn't exist and had to fix that. In fact, the character that I had, so like I said, so the Seniority Chronicles are more modern day. The Forged in Shadow is this sort of a prequel trilogy, standalone, same world though. And I realized this character that I killed was never ever mentioned in the main series. So I've written that off as well. It's because he died. So don't mention him anymore.
It was a long time ago.
You know.
Yes.
But yeah, so a few things like that. And then of course I've had characters where, you know, their eye color changed from, you know, blue to green, or hair color changed from blonde to brown or whatever. And I think all of that has been caught in the copy edit or final proofing stage, but thank you, Mom, for that.
Good.
Yeah, so I've had, I mean, yeah, I think everyone writing fantasy must at some point have a person who is killed and then comes back to life. You have the person who dies at least, who dies coming back to life and is possibly killed 2 or even 3 times, just a very minor character. So I've definitely had that. I've had someone pointing out that this person died chapters ago.
Magic.
That's a very, very good. I have a very, very good copy editor, and you get this really annoying thing where you get this note, and they're basically telling you off because you've slightly misspelled just by one consonant, the name of someone's cousin's next door neighbour's cat who is mentioned twice, and you've got the name slightly wrong the second time, and your copy editor is really like, you have spelled this name wrong. Like, I made that person up, and also they are one of the second level characters' cousin's next door neighbour's cat. I'm feeling really like my copy editor is getting a big stress for getting their name wrong, and how stupid am I? But that's cool. But actually, the one thing that really annoys me is when I was I realise in the Tower of Living and Dying there's a river that has 2 different names, because at one point it's called the Jaxartane because it's named after the river Jaxartes, which is one of the great classical rivers. It's a river in the Central Asia that Alexander crossed. And then but I also called the river it's called the Haliakmon, and it's after the river in Macedon that flows near the royal palaces at Aegina. And I couldn't decide whether I wanted to name which of those rivers the river was going to be named after, and it's to be named after both. But I'm kind of thinking, well, hey, it's like one tributary to the other. So that really, when I discovered that.
Did you end up having to pick one, or is it there twice? Or with 2 names?
It's there twice. Yeah. It's there as both. It's named as both. It was too late, but the book had been published. But I did then. So one of them is now the Haliak, now a tributary of the Jaxartane. I have decided.
I think one time, just despite my editor, like she pointed out something where I had called it something different before. So instead of fixing it, I explained why this person would call it something different.
Nice. Okay.
This is going totally off topic, but a terrible warning to anyone, because we've all done that. You have a character and then you get right to the end of the book and you think they are not called Simon at all. They're actually called John. And you think, I will do change all. So I had a terrible story I was told at university by someone whose friend had written a novel, and the central character through the whole book was called David. And the character, then they decided then quite late on in writing the book, they were going to change the character's name. They're going to call them George. So they did a change all, and it was all fine. And then when they read the published book, there's a little bit where they go to Florence and they go and stand. Great statue of Michelangelo's George. So, okay, maybe so think slightly what you're doing before you just press change all, because it's.
I got caught out by my 10-year-old son. I was doing an interview for one of the fantasy magazines and explaining that in the bone ships there is no mammals in this world. It's all birds, and that's very important to it, the way they think and how it feeds through the words and the way I use language. And then I finished it and turned it off. My little boy was stood there and he went, "They're all mammals, Daddy." And I went, yes. And he went, what about the people? I was like, Gah! Shut up. So he lives in the shed now. That's what
That's good. All right, good. We got some questions from the audience. So let me just have a quick look. Some of them are a little bit focused on the plotters, and as we established, I am the only person with any sense. So I will try not answering those ones. But has anybody ever had any problems picking plots for your books?
No.
No.
I've done, because I'm making it up as I go along. I've done it where I've written a thing that breaks every sort of little thing that I thought I was going to. But as I said earlier, I just kind of embrace that. So problems are fun things to try and get around for me.
Yep.
Yes.
So for me, like I've done a lot of reading and you know, read a lot of craft books, things on story structure and you know, plot design and all of that. And so I have that in my head. So when I go to write a story, it's kind of again that percolation idea where all these ideas, all these things that I've read, including the nonfiction, the craft side of things, they all exist back here, and they're muddling together until something comes up. So for me, I don't really have a plot problem, I won't say, but it's where I try, when I'm writing, I really try to inhabit those characters, and so it's where they're going, and then as I'm following that, kind of on the side, I have the spreadsheet that has the plot outline, the actual, you know, the 4-act structure. And I fill that in as I go. So I know that I'm not going too far off accepted plot or story, you know, I don't want to confuse readers or anything like that, right? So I don't go off on too many tangents by staying within that spreadsheet and kind of using that to guide me. But overall, I'm in those characters. I'm trying to make the decisions that they would actually make given the situation that they find themselves in. And so because of that, I don't address plot directly very often, if that makes sense. I go with the character decisions first and then find the plot from how they're reacting to things.
Yeah, no, so I mean, my books they're not hugely complicated plots. They're actually really quite simple stories. And yeah, that's very much about the characters and the world and the feelings that are evoked in quite a simple plot. I mean, I think the issue with the third book of a trilogy is that kind of sense of we know how it ends, and there is that sense of kind of, it's a bit like that point where, you know, you've got a big night out and you're just kind of sitting around and you're kind of not really going to settle too much because, you know, you're going out later. Actually, if you remember in those days long ago,
Right.
you know, if it's like, you know, if it's like a family wedding or something, you're like, that morning you don't do anything, just sitting around, like there's no point starting anything because we're going to the wedding later or whatever. And a book 3 was a bit like that. There was a bit of sense of like, well, we'll just kind of wibble around a bit. And then we've got the big end. So maybe we could just have, you know, it was almost like, well, this is either going to be a very thin book.
Or it's 100 pages of having a cup of tea.
Yes, that kind of, I had someone describe this lovely description, it was wombling about. You womble about for a while.
Yeah.
Because that vague kind of sense of, well, all I'm doing is padding it out before we get to the big ending. And that was probably the hardest point, that sense of, on the one hand, there's a huge amount I want to say in book 3, and this is the end, and you know, I've got to get it all down. And the other hand, it's like, well, we're just wombling about waiting for the end because I know what the end is. So why don't I just like skip to the end now? And that was the only tricky point for that kind of sense of, what are they doing? They can't just sit around tea for a couple of pages.
Yep.
It was quite hard going from the assassin books, which are crime novels really, and they're very densely plotted, and there are red herrings and there are what's going on and all this, to the Bone Ships, which is a book where not much happens for a long time, and it's really deliberate, but it's a really simple plot. There is just sort of one line going all the way through it, and I had a massive crisis of confidence with just what am I writing? I'm writing this book where nothing happens, where I come from writing things, and there's a fair amount of readers who've gone not much happens, but it is the point of it, because it's a book about ships, and there are vast moments of boredom on a ship, and I wanted that to come across, and repetition and strangeness. So that was kind of a lot of the time my mind was going, more stuff should be happening, more stuff should be, and I was having to hold myself back from inventing lots of stuff to just go on in it. But I really didn't want to do that. I wanted to write a Patrick O'Brien book in which nothing happens for 300 pages and then there's 2 pages of battle. My editor wasn't having that though. She was just like, no.
That's good. Simon, anything for you?
No, I never have a particular problem coming up with plots. My approach is generally to kind of say at any one point as I'm writing, wouldn't it be cool if, and just come up with a cool, fun thing that might happen to the characters. And very often that's a plot twist, or it might foreshadow something that's coming up later. But I have files and files full of plots and story ideas that I can just dip into if I need to.
That's great.
And I generally ignore them completely. Never look at them.
Right. Yeah. So maybe one last question. I don't know how we do for time if we'll get stopped, but we got a question here on tropes, which I think is kind of related, and maybe we'll spin it both ways. So do you either have a trope that you dislike, that you find yourself using, or just like what's a trope that you love and you're just going to use it wherever you possibly can? Anybody? Whoever wants to shout out first.
I don't read anything about writing or what writing involves, or if tropes or anything like that, because there's a little bit of my mind that if it reads about these things, will then try and avoid them, and I don't want to do that. I want to just go with what I think will be the most fun, and I don't care whether it's been done before by somebody else, because that doesn't matter. It can be the most boring thing, and each of us could be given the most run-of-the-mill fantasy thing ever, and each of us would write something entirely different and with our own flavor, because it is not about what an idea is. It's about the execution of that idea. That is the important thing. The idea of tropes and stuff, kind of, it's good shorthand, but it's not. I don't actually, for me, think it's useful to help you write. I think it's kind of putting limits on yourself that you don't need.
Yeah.
So for me, I mean, the Empires of Dust it's absolutely my love letter to all the tropes of fantasy. I love fantasy tropes. That's why we read fantasy. That's why, why do people love crime? Because of the crime tropes. Why do people love romance? Because of the romance tropes. Why do people love fantasy? Because of the fantasy tropes. I love that stuff. I love stuff about hidden heirs and magic swords and destiny. All of it. That's why I love fantasy. But that's Empires of Dust is completely my love letter to that. It's got all the tropes, but it's also my critique of it. I've always read fantasy in a very political way. I have intense political issues with a lot of ideas about a lot of the tropes. A lot of fantasy tropes are fundamentally profoundly problematic. They're profoundly conservative. They're profoundly right-wing. They're profoundly toxic masculinity. They're intensely problematic politically. And I have actually always read fantasy novels against the grain in that way, and read them, and I guess not realised that perhaps they were being, that the simplicity of the trope was not something you were critiquing. But Empires of Dust is completely a critique of all of those tropes at the same time. It's my absolute passionate love letter to the Lord of the Rings, but also my critique of and political response to the Lord of the Rings. And that, I think that's what we're all doing with tropes. Again, that's, you're taking tropes and you're doing new things with them and commenting on what's come before and repositioning them, and using them as frameworks to express one's own ideas and one's own thoughts. That's what literature is. All literature is tropes. Or Anna Karenina is a trope about. Anna Karenina is a very tropey novel. The War and Peace is an incredibly tropey novel. And Punishment is an incredibly tropey novel, because that's what stories are. They're tropes, and then it's what you do with the tropes. I think people get really people get really worried about the idea that they shouldn't be using them, or they're too cliched. And obviously, if you just rewrite Lord of the Rings, but worse and with different names, with bad prose and different names, obviously that's probably not really a workbook writing or reading. But you can't avoid those tropes. You can't escape those tropes. That's what the structure of a fantasy novel is, essentially. It's what you do with them and what you say with what you're saying within them.
I think tropes can be like this good way of attracting readers to something that they feel comfortable with, and then you change it and you smack them in the face with something different, and then that kind of like makes it interesting too. It's like, you know, and a little bit of that claiming the tropes for yourself, because you, like you say, you don't want to hear the same stuff all the time, do you?
I do think you have to be careful. I mean, actually, because something like the second of the new Star Wars trilogy was a classic in this, where a lot of it almost seemed to be the kind of, well, you've got all the fancy tropes there, and that whole kind of issue, you know, who is Rey in the whole of the first film, and that's, you know, that's the classic trope. And then the second film is basically just a kind of, oh yeah, you thought it was going to be a trope, did you? How dumb, you know, how fucking stupid are you if you thought that it wasn't kind of interesting repositioning of the trope. It was just a kind of, oh yeah, well, you know, you thought you'd worked it out, had you? Because it's a farm boy trope. Well, no, F you. And that kind of deliberate, just not doing something interesting with the trope, but just kind of trying to kind of, I don't know, what, shock people, annoy people. That just seemed to be an example of people doing something, just stupidity, essentially, around very classic plot, traditional kind of classic plots, fantasy plot narratives.
Yeah, okay. Megan or Simon, anything to add on your favorite tropes?
Well, I do like characters who deliberately kick against the tropes. So, I mean, your classic trope, I suppose, is your chosen one who's fulfilling some prophecy that's given to them. And I have several characters who deliberately reject that and don't want to be the chosen one and don't want to have to go and do the thing to defeat the thing. You know, they don't want to be like that. And very often they end up doing it anyway, because it wouldn't be a great story otherwise. But it's kind of like they know the trope and they're rejecting it as they go along.
That's great.
And I'll just say that kind of in the same way, I think I try not to focus on tropes too much, because it, you know, as Anna said and Simon said too as well, to some extent, it's about what you do with them, right? So it's twisting it in a way that doesn't negate them, which is, I think, what happened with Star Wars. You know, they set up a very classic, I mean, classic because of the original Star Wars, I guess, but a very classic story in the first new movie. I always forget the specific titles. Anyway, the first new movie, and then in the second one, they go around and just negate that. And what that did, in my mind, was just negate the whole story. So you have to be very aware, I guess, to some extent, but at the same time, not worry about them. Just tell the story in your way and how it makes sense for your characters and what they're doing. So as far as like favorites, I mean, I've got sidekicks in my stories. I've got myths, you know, mythological creatures. I've got the enchanted sword. I've got, you know, the what's the actual name with the hidden heir or whatever. I've got a lot of these in my stories, but I try to make them fresh rather than saying, oh, I'm going to have this in my stories. No, this is this character and this is her story and this is how she's approaching it in a new and different way, hopefully. And hopefully you like it.
Yep,
I mean,
it's great.
Actually, going back to the Star Wars thing, because I gave a talk on writing series and sequels a while ago, and the two things I was holding up as really examples of just how not to do it. Well, on the one hand, yeah, the second of the new Star Wars films, because it's an absolute just you set up the really classic tropes in book one, and then you just knock it down in a really not an interesting way. And the others, of course, are George R.R. Martin, where you've got that, you know, the big plot twist is you kill off the main character, kill off a big character, which is fantastic when you do it once, possibly twice. But then, you know, the books have now, and I think some fantasy novel people are kind of influenced by this to do this, where you've got to keep having the big shock plot twist of the big reveal and the big absolute shock plot twist of someone being killed or someone turning out to be not who you think they are, and then you get this horrible plot that just becomes so clunky and so unworkable, or you then have to have the lengthy explanation of what the hell is going on and how anyone gets, and those are kind of the two in two different ways. The two really, I guess, just don't do either of those two things. Those really seem to be examples of how not to write.
Yeah, Anna, did you, when you taught that class,
I
did you have any
loved-
good examples of movies that did it well?
I would say the second Star Wars movie. I loved it. I think it's a very flawed film in many ways, but I would always take a flawed thing that throws out what you expect over something like The Force Awakens, which was just a retread. Yes, I think it did. I really enjoyed it.
It was just,
yeah,
and completely just negated. It was just a sort of, it was the kind of shock twist for the point of it.
No, I think it made beautiful sense. And for the first time, you had a Jedi who actually acted like they said they were, that he wasn't actually interested in fighting. He wanted to find another way around it. And also, I'm quite influenced by the fact I just thought it was beautiful to look at, with the battle in the desert and the way they blew the spaceship apart. It was just, I could quite actually watch it with the sound off, which is quite joyous for me as well. But no, I really enjoyed that. I hated the third one.
I still haven't seen the third one. And just so everyone knows, we'll probably have to take RJ and Anna to a separate Zoom meeting or like YouTube channel where they can debate the Star Wars, the second of the last trilogy.
Well, I think it just illustrates what is the thing about art, is that one person's joyous thing is another person's complete failure, and that's what I love about any art, is that it's not set in stone. You can't know what somebody's going to think, and I love that. I love that Anna is absolutely right in what she says, but so can the people that love it can be absolutely right, and that's okay.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for being here, Megan, Anna, RJ, and Simon. It was a really interesting conversation. Thank you for making the time. And I know it's basically bedtime, probably for you, for at least 3 of you guys right now. So yeah, this is the end of QuaranCon today, I think. There's another exciting packed schedule of stuff tomorrow. Any of you guys on a panel tomorrow?
RJ and I are talking about writing diverse characters, right?
I'm not on that one. I've had to bow out of that one.
Oh, so yeah, no, I'm in that case. I'm talking about diversity in fantasy tomorrow. I just to say that I'm just dyslexic, dyspraxic, celiac disorder, and I may also have a heart defect. So I'm probably.
Okay.
There are a few bits of me that work well, basically.
Excellent. So join Anna tomorrow for that session, and then I think there's 3 other great panels tomorrow. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone. Good night, and we'll see you soon.
Well done, David. That was brilliant. Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.